In Module 2, we'll be exploring psychology as a science. We'll cover topics such as interpreting data, understanding different research designs, and conducting research on human subjects in an ethical manner. In this first video, we'll start by talking in general about the scientific method, especially as it relates to psychology as a domain of inquiry. We live in an amazing, complex world. From tiny microbes to stars and faraway galaxies, there is so much to explore. In psychology, we are particularly interested in learning about people. Specifically, psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. As we saw in the previous module, this is a complex topic in its own right, with many subfields each focused on a different aspect of psychology. One thing that each of these subfields have in common, however, is that they all use the scientific method. The scientific method is an iterative process that uses empirical data to test ideas. First, the scientific method usually starts with a theory. A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. Good theories should give comprehensive explanations, be supported by evidence, and make predictions about future aspects of the world that can then be tested. For example, one theory of relationship commitment, the investment model, proposes that one's feelings of commitment to one's romantic partner are primarily comprised of three factors: one's current satisfaction level in the relationship, one's prior level of investment in the relationship, and the quality of potential alternatives. All else being equal, the model predicts that people will feel more committed to their relationships when they are relatively satisfied, have a higher level of investment in the relationship, such as being together for a long time or sharing resources such as a house, and when they believe that their current partner is better than any potential alternatives. In turn, one's commitment to the relationship should predict engaging in the kinds of behaviors that will continue to maintain the relationship over time, such as forgiving one's partner, thinking in terms of we rather than me, etc. Theories are repeatedly checked against the world, but they tend to be too complex to be tested all at once. Instead, researchers create hypotheses to test specific aspects of a theory. A hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if our idea is correct, and is often worded as an if-then statement. Let's go back to our investment model. We might hypothesize, for example, that if couples have a higher level of investment in their relationship, such as owning a home together, then they will be more likely to be committed in their relationship and thus more likely to stay together over time. This now leads to a very important step: collecting objective data and comparing it with our hypothesis. For example, we could potentially get a sample of romantic couples and measure them over several months or years to see which couples stay together and which break up. We could also measure things about the relationship, like investment size, and see if that predicts relationship longevity. Based on our investment model theory, we would predict that if couples have a higher level of investment in the relationship, then they should be less likely to break up, compared to couples who have a lower level of investment in the relationship. Indeed, this is what many such studies testing the investment model have found. However, even though many studies have found evidence consistent with the investment model, notice that this did not necessarily have to be the case. That is, the data could have been either consistent with the predictions from the investment model, or they could have been inconsistent. In other words, investment size didn't necessarily have to correlate with relationship longevity. This leads to our last important point. Scientific theories should be falsifiable. That is, they should make a testable prediction that could either be consistent or inconsistent with the overall theory. The scientific philosopher Karl Popper called these kinds of falsifiable predictions risky predictions. Risky because they expose the scientist to the potential that he or she could be wrong. For example, Einstein's theory of relativity makes predictions about how light would move around a body of mass as it bent space-time. This was actually able to be tested during the 1919 solar eclipse. However, Einstein's prediction was risky because it made a very bold, specific prediction about the exact degree of light deflection that should be observed. If the data were inconsistent with Einstein's prediction, it would mean Einstein's theory was wrong, at least to some degree. For more information on Karl Popper's thinking about falsifiability, you can check out the short supplemental video in Canvas. The scientific method is an iterative or ongoing process. As specific hypotheses are tested, theories are modified and refined to reflect and incorporate the result of these tests. More data can also lead to more questions. Many researchers spend their entire career researching and testing a single theory. Why use the scientific method? To explore this question, let's consider a thought experiment. Let's say that a friend has recommended that you try a new herbal supplement, which is supposed to help reduce anxiety. You take the supplement and decide that you feel a little bit better. Did the supplement actually work? When we rely on evidence from personal stories of one or two people like this one, this is referred to as anecdotal evidence. Although anecdotal evidence can be helpful, it also comes with a few limitations. First, in this example, we don't know what would have happened otherwise. That is, would you have felt better even if you did not take the supplement? Perhaps the weather got nice outside, or you got a good grade on an exam, and that's actually what boosted your overall mood. Another possibility is that you only felt better because you expected to, something called the placebo effect. The placebo effect occurs when we feel better simply because we take a treatment that we expect will work, even if the treatment itself is completely inert. A benefit of using the scientific method, therefore, is that we can conduct larger-scale experiments with many people. We can also include comparison groups that help us to rule out alternative explanations, such as placebo effects. In Section 4 of this module, we'll talk more about experiments and why they help us to do precisely that. It's also important to note, however, that the scientific method is not without its flaws. First, scientific theories represent our best approximations based on current evidence. While these theories may be useful in that they allow us to predict how the world will likely behave, every scientific theory is to some degree incomplete, and there is always the possibility that it will at some point need to be updated. For example, Newton's laws about gravity stood the test of time and were consistent with observable evidence for hundreds of years, until Einstein's theory of relativity updated our understanding of gravity and tweaked Newton's formulas slightly. Second, even though the scientific method attempts to be objective, that is, above human subjectivity and biases, it's not completely immune to human fallibility. The scientific method still requires that a person asks a question and investigates it in a particular way. The method that people use to gather their data, the way they interpret that data, and even the kinds of questions they think to ask in the first place are all potentially subject to human bias. There have also unfortunately been instances of outright fraud in science, that is, researchers completely faking their data and/or results. Trustworthy scientific evidence should therefore be reproducible, that is, doing the same experiment in the same way should generate basically the same result, even if the study is conducted by a different team of researchers with a different sample. There is a growing understanding in the scientific community of the need for these kinds of replication studies. When the same result has been replicated many times, even by different research teams, it gives us greater confidence that the result can be trusted. Finally, it's also worth pointing out that the scientific method is not the only way of learning about our world. For example, many communities rely on cultural and generational knowledge that has been passed down from one generation to the next. Even though this kind of knowledge has not been through the scientific process, it nevertheless can still be very useful. As one example, indigenous communities in North America practiced a method called Three Sisters planting, which involves planting corn, beans, and squash together, long before there was a scientific explanation for its benefits. Communities may also possess valuable information not included in the scope of scientific inquiry. Whereas a scientific study tends to be very focused and narrow, community knowledge may span a broader range of variables that could potentially impact a relevant outcome. Scientists need to keep this in mind when attempting to apply their findings to a real-life scenario. In this video, we covered the scientific method, what it is, why it can be beneficial, and why it can also still be limited. For the exam, you should be able to describe each component of the scientific method, define theory, and identify the qualities that make a good scientific theory, define anecdotal evidence and placebo effect, describe reproducibility in science, and discuss the benefits and drawbacks of using the scientific method to learn about our world.